Dear Ministers, Your Excellencies, dear Presidents and Directors, dear partners of ESCP Europe chairs, dear colleagues, dear participants and students, dear guests. It's a great honor for me to introduce Her Excellency Dr. Professor Ameenah Gurib-Fakim. It's a challenge to summarize in just a few words the achievement of such an outstanding scholar, entrepreneur, and politician. Whilst preparing this introductory speech, I noticed she has a 32-page, single-spaced curriculum vitae. To start off with, being here in an academic institution, I have to say that Professor Gurib-Fakim is a highly recognized scholar. She received her PhD from the University of Exeter, chairperson of chair-professor of organic chemistry. She also served as Dean and Vice-Chancellor of the University of Mauritius. Professor Gurib-Fakim is the author of some 30 books and more than 100 academic articles. In 2007, she received the L'Oréal UNESCO Award for Women in Science. She received this very well-known distinction for her exploration and analysis of plants from Mauritius and their biomedical applications. She was a chairperson of the Food Forever initiative of the Crop Trust in Germany and the co-chair of the United Nations Water Panel in the US. Professor Gurib-Fakim is also a very successful entrepreneur. For 4 years, she has been managing director of the Center for Phytotherapy and Research, which became the CIDP Research and Innovation Company. Her academic research led to innovative entrepreneurial projects. She also received many distinctions, including Grand Croix de la Légion d'honneur in France. She was part of the Foreign Policy Global Thinkers in 2015 and the Forbes 2016 list of powerful women in the world. She was awarded 4 Doctorate Honoris Causa from universities in UK, India, Pakistan, including Pierre and Marie Curie La Sorbonne in France. She is also a fellow from the African Academy of Sciences, the Linnean Society in the UK, the World Islamic Academy of Science in London and in Jordan, as well as the African Science Institute in the US. Last but not least, Ameenah served from 2015 to 2018 as President of the Republic of Mauritius. She was the first ever woman elected to this prestigious position. I should also mention that she was elected by the Parliament at the unanimity of the different political parties. I have many friends in Mauritius, and I can tell you that they were extremely proud to have such a great president and a brilliant global ambassador for the country. We could not have dreamed a better keynote speaker for the first conference of our Stand Up for a Sustainable World series, co-organized with the Chaire of Circular Economie. This chair is led by my colleagues, Professors Valentina Carbone and Aurélien Acquier. Valentina and Aurélien will manage the Q&A session just after the presentation. Our Dean, Professor Franck Bournois, together with Professor Valérie Moiti, Dean for Faculty, and Professor Léon Loluza, Executive President and Deputy Dean of the school, will then proceed to the awarding ceremony of a degree of Doctorate Honoris Causa to Her Excellency Dr. Professor Ameenah Gurib-Fakim. This event is also transmitted online via YouTube for our friends based on our different campuses in Spain, in Italy, in Germany, in Poland, and in London, in the UK also, as well as to the French Institute in Mauritius. Now it's time for me to leave the stage to allow Ameenah to address a very important issue: climate change and implication for sustainable development in Africa and small island developing states. Thank you.
Merci, cher Bertrand. Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. It is a pleasure to be with you at ESCP, this most venerable and impressive 200-year-old institution. And I would like to begin by expressing sympathy for the tragedy that struck the Notre Dame Cathedral, France's most revered and iconic symbol of beauty and history. I'm sure that the legendary resolve of the French people will help to restore it in record time so that this precious patrimony can once again be a gift to the world and to be enjoyed by all. I'm honored to have the opportunity to talk about a topic that is central to our times: climate change and sustainable development, as I strongly believe that the themes are interlinked. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to begin by paying tribute to France's leadership in the area of sustainable development and climate actions. In 2015, a big, bold new global agenda, Agenda 2030, was adopted, and 17 Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, were agreed upon by the global development community, including France. That same year, France played host to one of the largest gatherings to address climate change, the meeting of the Conference of Parties, COP21, that led to the landmark Paris Agreement on climate change. I was honored to lead the Mauritian delegation at this important meeting, and the agreement came into force on the 4th of November 2016, and it is notable that 55 countries, accounting for over 50% of global greenhouse gas emissions, had signed it. As of April 2019, according to the UNFCCC, more than 185 parties have ratified the agreement, an expression of the strengthening global resolve to fight climate change, with the exception of one country that shall remain unnamed. It is clear that sustainable development cannot be achieved without decisive action to adapt and mitigate climate change. That's why Agenda 2030 has a dedicated goal, SDG 13, that challenges the global community to take, I quote, urgent action to combat climate change and its impact, unquote. It is noteworthy that SDG 13 recognizes the need to build capacity for tackling climate change in least developed countries and small island developing states, the SIDS, with a particular focus on women, youth, and local and marginalized communities. This goal urges the international community to strengthen resilience and adaptive capacity to climate-related hazards and natural disasters in all countries, integrate climate change measures into national policies, strategies, and planning, improve education awareness raising and human and institutional capacity on climate change mitigation, adaptation, impact reduction, and early warning, and to implement the previous commitment by developed countries under the UNFCCC to the goal of mobilizing $100 billion in climate finance annually by 2020. At the Paris meeting, countries made voluntary pledges to reduce emissions through nationally determined contribution, the NDCs. Notwithstanding these pledges, it is abundantly clear that the threat of climate change cannot be solved by any one nation working alone. Country-level actions need to be complemented by multilateral efforts. In 2018, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC special report, reported on the consequences of global warming at 1.5 degrees centigrade and above. The panel reminded us that the threat to our planet and its people is more serious than we thought. Recent climatic events are constant reminders that along with the changing climate, nature is becoming more ferocious, natural disasters are more frequent and even more frightening, impacting poor people the hardest. Climate change is increasingly being referred to as the greatest existential threat of our time. It has already cost the global economy $2 trillion over the last 20 years. The 2017 World Economic Report has identified climate change as one of the 5 trends that will impact global development. The other 4 being rising inequality, increased polarization of societies, rising cyber dependency, and an aging population. It is abundantly clear that time is running out and that radical actions are needed to cut emissions, sharply reduce the consumption of fossil fuels, and eliminate subsidies while boosting investment in sustainable, renewable energy so as to avert a rise in global temperature above 1.5 degrees centigrade. It is equally clear that no nation, however small or large, wealthy or poor, can escape the full impacts of a changing climate. For us, ladies and gentlemen, living in small island developing states, rising sea levels are threatening every coastline. More powerful storms, intense floods, frequent droughts, and crop failures are combining to exacerbate hunger, fuel conflicts, ignite strife, and all that is happening in places where hunger and conflicts are already exacting a heavy toll on local populations. Other climate change risks, which are not often spoken about, and including, I think, I will make a point here of mentioning, undernutrition with its potential for lifelong impacts on human health, productivity, and development, increase in vulnerability to malaria and diarrheal diseases, reduced crop productivity with strong adverse effects on regional, national, and household food security, adverse effects on livestock linked to temperature rise and precipitation changes, changes in the incidence and geographic range of vector and waterborne diseases due to changes in the mean and variability of temperatures and precipitation, shifts in biome distribution and severe impacts on wildlife, and I think the recent IPBES report has confirmed that over 1 million species are at risk. Degradation of coral reef results in loss of protective ecosystem and fish stock, and here we have Australia's iconic Great Barrier Reef has had an unprecedented coral bleaching event affecting over 700 kilometers of the northern reef. Frequent and violent cyclones, Mozambique's Cyclone Idai and India's Fani, confirm the vulnerability of developing countries to the negative impacts of climate change. Stress on water resources currently facing significant strain from overexploitation and degradation and increased future demand, and I think we saw in Cape Town 2017, was the world most stressed city in the world, and the list goes on. Our generation's response to this challenge will be judged by history. For if we fail to meet it boldly, swiftly, and together, we risk consigning future generation to an irreversible catastrophe. And yet, we can reverse it. John F. Kennedy once observed that, I quote, "Our problems are man-made, therefore they can be resolved by men." It is true that for too many years, mankind has been slow to respond to or even recognize the magnitude of a climate threat. Fortunately, change is coming from an unexpected source: young people. One has to recall the remarkable testimony of a 16-year-old girl, old Greta Thunberg, at the last COP meeting in Poland, to see the power of young people to change the world's trajectory on fighting climate change. Her plaintive appeal was simple as it was compelling. We can't save the world by playing by the rules, because the rules have to be changed. In the United States, a charismatic 20-year-old Varshini Prakash had co-founded the Sunrise Movement, and she's the newest star in the field of climate activism. Her message on sea rise should resonate with all islanders, including Mauritius, and I quote, "I currently live in a place called East Boston, and that's the place where if we don't take action in the next couple of decades, it will cease to exist, and we'll be lost to the seas forever." For us islanders, ladies and gentlemen, climate change constitutes an existential threat. In 2017, Mauritius was already 13th in the positioning of the World Risk Report and highest disaster risk, and 7th on the list of countries most exposed to national hazards. And as we keep discussing about climate change, the latest analysis by the UN High Commissioner for Refugees estimate that on average 21.5 million people have been displaced by climate or extreme weather-related events each year since 2008. And the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction reports that close to 1 billion people were affected by natural disasters in 2015. These numbers are phenomenal and should surely boggle our minds. So, what are the challenges? Every day, climate pollution imperils our present, and climate action compromises our present and mortgages our future. Among the many economy-wide impacts, a changing climate is disrupting the hydrological cycle, evaporating water vapor from the oceans, and leading to stronger storms, more extreme floods, and longer and more extensive droughts, declining crop yields, increasing water stresses, and spreading tropical diseases poleward, precipitating refugee crisis and political instability, among a range of other problems. It is clear that any rise in global temperature would have catastrophic consequences for sustainable development, especially in Africa and SIDS, which are highly vulnerable. A cluster of interconnected environmental risks include extreme weather events. Climate change and water crises have consistently featured among the top-ranked global risks in the past 7 editions of the Global Risk Report. The World Bank forecast that water stress could cause extreme societal stress in regions such as the Middle East and the Sahel, where the economic impact of water scarcity could put at risk 6% of the GDP by 2050. The bank also forecasts that water availability in cities could decline by as much as 2/3 by 2050 as a result of climate change, and competition from energy generation and agriculture. The Indian government advised that at least 330 million people were affected by droughts in 2016. The confluence of risk around water scarcity, climate change, extreme weather events, and involuntary migration remains a potential cocktail for a risk multiplier, especially in the world's economy most fragile environmental and political context. With power and influence increasingly distributed, however, there is a growing recognition that the response to environmental risk cannot be delivered by international agencies and governments alone. Also, we do not seem to see the interconnectedness of environmental risk with other risk categories. 4 of the top 10 risk interconnections involve environmental risk, the most frequently cited as being a pairing of water crises and failure of climate change mitigation and adaptation. This shows that ineffective management of the global commons, the oceans, the atmosphere, the climate change, the climate system, is having local and global consequences. Ladies and gentlemen, climate change is threatening the progress and development made in half the past century. It threatens to reverse the gains made through the MDGs and the undermining efforts to achieve the SDGs. Changing weather patterns or water crises trigger and exacerbate geopolitical and societal risk, such as domestic or regional conflict and involuntary migration, particularly in geopolitically fragile areas. Deforestation and unsustainable energy practices are increasing greenhouse gas emission fast and further exacerbating climate challenges. Failure to invest in low-carbon development locks countries into unsustainable, high-emission development pathways far from the low-carbon, climate-resistant future the world needs. A disproportionate burden for these events is being carried by the poorest and most vulnerable people and by vulnerable countries which lack the means to adapt to what is happening. SIDS are seeing the encroachment of seawater on their lands and groundwater and are threatened by more intense storms, such as seen in Vanuatu, Bahamas, and Dominica. Communities from Alaska to Fiji and Kiribati have already been dislocated or making plans to move because the rising sea levels threaten their lands. In drought-prone regions like the Sahel and Horn of Africa, food insecurity and poor harvests have become more frequent. The high vulnerability of the African continent and island states to the negative impact of climate change result from the fact that, as a whole, these regions have high dependency on natural resources, poor infrastructure, pervasive poverty, and weak institutional capacity to respond and mitigate environmental disaster effectively. One could always argue that environmentally induced migration is not a new phenomenon, but it is being accentuated, especially for those living in rural areas, as climate change is eroding livelihoods, accentuating conflicts, and exacerbating instability in conflict-prone areas. So, what are the opportunities for action? Africa and the SIDS are the most vulnerable areas of the world that will bear the brunt of climate change. Ironically, this region and nations have contributed least to climate change. Now just think about this. In the United States, Hurricane Katrina generated losses of $160 billion back in 2005, about 1% of the GDP. Compare against Dominica in 2017, where damages after Hurricane Maria exceeded 200% of the GDP. It follows that building resilience to natural disasters and climate change in island states is a necessity and not a luxury. IMF study shows that investment in public capital resilient to natural disasters can increase potential GDP between 3 to 11% in the states of the Caribbean. However, high public debt and limited fiscal space are the major handicap. So what needs to be done? As we look to concerted climate actions, it is clear that industrialized countries have been the leading contributors of greenhouse gases, will need to step up to the plate and do their fair share in tackling the sustainable development challenges posing by climate change. This challenge can only be met if they lead. For their part, emerging economies must keep their eyes on the Sustainable Development Goals and develop adaptation and mitigation strategies that are commensurate with the scale and scope of the challenges. Take the example of renewable energy. Bloomberg New Energy Finance reported that global investment in renewable capacity in 2015 was $266 billion, more than double the allocations to new coal and gas capacity. The IAEA, the International Energy Agency, reported that the total generation capacity of renewable energy now exceeds coal-fired power plants for the first time. And for the past 2 years, greenhouse gas emission has been decoupled from economic growth. While most research suggests the shift to clean energy could create a substantial increase in net employment, the overall policy equation is complex and may require new approaches to skill training and retraining, along with measures to facilitate increased labor force mobility. Ensuring such transition will be important for societal stability and cohesion, and the pace of change need to accelerate. The need of the hour is to build multi-actor, multi-sector alliances, and coalition for action, those that can cut horizontally across traditional boundaries of interest, expertise, and geographic boundaries. Our effort to solve the climate crisis are a race against time, but the technologies embodying the fourth industrial revolution and the implication of these challenges for business and society contain constant hope for the acceleration of the necessary solutions to the climate crisis. To keep global warming to within 2 degrees, limit the risk of dangerous climate change, the world will need to reduce emission by 40% to 70% by 2050 and eliminate them altogether by 2100. While attention will focus on India, China, the European Union, and the United States, which collectively comprise more than half of the global emission, all countries will need to ratchet up their climate actions in order to limit warming to 2 degrees. Tackling climate change presents opportunities for green growth and jobs, new sources of export, and stimulation of trade and innovation. Ladies and gentlemen, 16 years ago, projections said that by 2010, the world would be able to install 30 gigawatts of wind capacity. By 2015, more than 14 times that amount was installed. Solar energy prices is also decreasing. Similar development are likely to occur across the board as new development of electric vehicles, smart grids, and microgrids, advanced manufacturing and material, and other areas continue to accelerate climate action. So it's not just the technology of the fourth industrial revolution that are directly making a difference. It is also the transformative operating models inherent within these technologies that contain the seeds for change. The Internet of Things has introduced a new world of hyperconnectivity that allows us to approach decision-making in an entirely new manner. So what we need, we cannot, ladies and gentlemen, we cannot meet the challenges unless all the largest emitters of greenhouse gas pollution act together in concert and in a new spirit of sharing and cooperation. First, climate actions need to be integrated into all development planning. This is not something separate from planning and sustainable development. We must also energize our effort to put other developing nations, especially the poorest and most vulnerable, on a path to sustainable growth. For these are the nations that are already living with unfolding effects of warming planet, famine, drought, disappearing coastal villages, and the conflicts that arise from scarce resources. Their future is no longer a choice between a growing economy and a cleaner planet, because their survival depends on both. It will do little good to alleviate poverty if one can no longer harvest crops or find drinkable water. So the authorities have been successful for obtaining grants financing from Climate Fund, including for water projects, and this has been the case for a ministry dedicated for climate resilience in Grenada. So innovative hurricane clauses have been introduced into debt contracts to limit resource outflow in case of damaging storms. And there are many other good examples of good practice around the world. New Zealand and the Philippines created effective natural disaster funds. So in conclusion, after too many years of inaction and denial, there is finally widespread recognition of the fundamental threat that climate change poses to us collectively. We know what needs to be done. We know that our planet's future depends on a global commitment to permanently reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We know that if we put the right rules and incentives in place, we will unleash the creative power of our best scientists, policymakers, engineers, and entrepreneurs to build a better world. Let us build on the momentum of the Paris meeting and forge new pathways of cooperation. Indeed, ESCP can serve as a launchpad for a renewed climate-sensitive push towards action. In charting our next steps forward, let us lean in on the younger generation. I frequently draw on an example from the world of science to make my case. It is a little-known fact that by the age of 23, Isaac Newton had made 3 of the greatest discoveries in science: differential calculus, composition of light, and laws of gravitation, and did all this when in the summer of 1665, His academic base in Cambridge had to be evacuated on account of the plague. But the journey is long, the journey will be hard, and time is not on our side. It is a journey that will require each of us to persevere, combat setback, and much like Greta Thunberg or Varshini Prakash, fight for every inch of progress. Let us begin that journey now, powered by our will to create a world that is safer, cleaner, and healthier than the one that we found. So in doing so, we will create a future that is worthy of our children. I thank you for your attention.
Thanks a lot for this inspiring and powerful speech. I'm honored to have the opportunity to open the debate with our precious guest. And I would like to ask her a question, first of all, addressing her first two extremely important roles, scientist and a politician. During your speech, you used very powerful words. You talk about climate change as being the strongest existential threats nowadays. You have been talking about devastating impact, urgent need to act now. And you also mentioned two broad reports made up by scientists all over the world, one on climate change, IPCC, and the other one on IPBES, on biodiversity. So I would say that climate change, biodiversity crisis are not a threat anymore. They are an urgent condition, reality right now, asking for action. So you have been able to shift from being a scientist to being a politician. We would like to understand why we don't manage to reach already a truly science-based policy-making action on a global scale, on national levels. Which are the true levels for you for action to include science in policy decision-making? I think you are the right person to enlighten us why we have not gone yet that far.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like, again, thank you for your question and also for your attention. I will, first of all, speak as a scientist. And by speaking as a scientist, that we are very good at producing fantastic, credible data, which eventually gets used in formulating policies. This is, again, rests with the power of institutions like ESCP and other great institutions that have generated data that have been able to shape policy. But unfortunately, as a scientist, and here I do my mea culpa, we're not very good at communicating science. So much so that we have not been able to convince precisely these policymakers that science matter. And science is at the, is the bedrock on which societies will become richer, more resilient, and of course, where we'll see, of course, sharing of resources and all the rest of it. So first of all, I think we need to develop a policy for proper science communication. And this applies across the board, not just scientists, scientists to policymakers, the press to policymakers. So get also very good reporters actually to communicate science. Now, having got the science, the information which have gone, of course, to the politicians and the policymakers, I will use policymakers more than politicians. And so the policymakers, they have to ensure that the right resources get dedicated to addressing these challenges. But unfortunately, we are living in an era where inequality is becoming the new normal. And it's no longer normal. And this is something that we have to fight. We have to ensure that our institutions precisely deliver on this narrative that inequality will exacerbate precisely all the challenges that we have been talking about. I have already mentioned that our resolve was to raise, for example, $200 billion by 2020. Are we there? Now, if we are near there, what will be the absorptive capacity in the regions beside that are challenged with issues of climate change? And again, it comes back again to institution. So having the narrative of bridging education, policymaking, good science, credible data, we will put in all the pillars together so as to be able to address the huge existential crisis which remains climate change.
So you declared in 2015, I saw an interview of you, you declared yourself before COP21 as a prudent optimist. Are you still like that now?
Yes, I remain a prudent optimist, even though sometimes you wake up in the morning, you tend to think, you know, are we still there? But I think we have to remain positive because, again, we go back to the sciences. We find that it is possible to decarbonize our economy. And we have seen the rise of renewable technologies, renewable energy, which has the potential to actually address a large part of this climate. But again, we need to have consistency in the messaging coming out now, politicians, in addressing this. Because if we don't have this consistency in delivering precisely this commitment, then I think prudency might be out of the window. We can still remain optimists, but no longer prudent.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
I would like to ask you another question, calling your entrepreneurial role and also referring to the systemic change that you were calling for action. And so let's build on an industry, tourism. For Mauritius is one of the leading industries. You have 1,300,000 visitors per year. And Mauritius has set the target to become a green destination by 2030. And then you talk about the flooding risk, the rise of water levels and so on. How an industry can set the scene to become a green destination, which are the priorities for tourism, for example, and which is the role of companies. We are in a management school, we have future entrepreneurs here. How this industry, building on that industry, how actors, private actors, can contribute to this change?
Thank you. I think here I will put the, if I may use, a responsibility on two actors. One is the provider of this service, which is, of course, the tourism industry, and the others, which will be the consumer of that industry. Now, in terms of the providers, they have to ensure that the right proper practices are being put in place. So that, for example, hotels will be called upon to increasingly recycle the waters and ensure that whatever they're producing is recyclable, right? But at the end of the day, there is also the responsibility for that consumer to demand precisely these sustainable practices. I'll just give one example. We use, overfishing is becoming a big challenge. So we can now, with proper technology, like for example, blockchain technology, see that the fish that is on our plate is coming from a sustainable source. And the technology is there. Now, at a click of our phone or whatever it is, we can go precisely on the entire supply chain. So technology is there at disposal. So it's both of us together, we can be able to make a difference. Now, you've mentioned tourism sector, the ocean affecting our coastal resources, but there is something else which is also very fundamental, the increasing use of plastics, which is now a huge challenge for life. Sea life and everywhere else. And we also know that it is very difficult to change habits. People are used to a certain way of life, and to make these changes. So we have to come up with with an effort, personal. Every citizen has to address this issue at one individual level. Again, come back to politicians and policymakers, but we tend to put the emphasis on them. But we as individuals, as citizens, we have to make this concerted, this informed effort to reduce our plastic and, of course, our impact on this planet.
Thanks a lot. I would like to address other citizens of our world to ask questions. Who wants to have the pleasure to have a dialogue with our precious guest? Can you introduce yourself so that everybody is aware?
Your Excellency, thank you for the very nice talk. I'm Dr. Dove, immersion, just as you. And I've been working for 50 years in France. You didn't talk a lot about the impact of emission on health. This is a primary issue, you know. Asthma and even cardiovascular diseases are now closely related to these emissions. I think one way to get the politicians, I prefer calling them politicians, sorry for that, we have to educate them just as we are educating our patients. We must show them how these emissions are just corrosive for the respiratory system, for the cardiovascular system, and even for the future youth, because this is a primary issue as well. What's your opinion on this sort of action?
Yes, again, absolutely. I mean, this is something that we need to keep on iterating and reiterating on the negative impacts of climate change on the weather, on the health of individual. But there are other things that politicians and the citizen, they are not aware. And again, to extrapolate on the health component, climate change is impacting the quality of foods. We're not talking about the quantity of foods, which is already impacting because of the failing harvest. We're talking about the quality of the food. So this is one thing. The other area that precisely extrapolating on the health issues, that we find that malaria is going, for example, in higher climate, in cooler regions in the part. And we have seen also how, for example, the Zika virus has moved from places in Africa to Brazil. And we know that it is linked because there has been changes, there has been variation, and they have been able to adapt in new areas. So these are, again, but how do you get this data? Again, we need to credible data generated from great institutions like ESCP, for example, and other, to actually convince them, but make it into the right sound bites so that they can be attuned to this. But more importantly, show them in terms of figures. Because politicians, policymakers, they respond to figures, they respond to impact on the GDP, they respond, I mean, we are still not yet into the Bhutan indicator of happiness. We still measure progress in percentage GDP. So we need to show them that within the mandate, what's going to be the impact of GDP, what's going to be the impact on growth of job creation for all these things, then you'll get this. But having said this, we still need the interface between the scientists and the policymakers to address this. And this is where we need very good science communication.
Thanks a lot. Yes. We would be happy if then one of our brilliant students joined the conversation.
Aisling Cashmore, I'm a philanthropy advisor. How are you doing? It was just a little question. How do you remain optimistic when faced with the enormity of this challenge? And because I feel like we talk about solutions, and you mentioned blockchain, which I think is an excellent solution, but the problem is when you look into it, you look at how much energy blockchain requires to power the system, and then you think, well, that's actually contributing towards the energy consumption, because unfortunately most of our energy at the moment is not necessarily renewable. And there's this kind of, you can get yourself into this little horrible spiral where you think, God, there's no way out. So I was just wondering how we remain optimistic in the face of all this information and the challenges that we face.
No, we still have to get into that cycle, you know, the virtuous cycle. Not look at the vicious cycle, the virtuous cycle, we have to get in there somewhere. Now, again, I give the figures that in 2010, it almost seemed impossible to see, for example, the cost of renewable energy. If we look at a country like India, where they are now increasingly powering villages with the renewable energy, the light and everything else. So I think we have to remain optimistic, but we have to keep on pushing the narrative that until and unless on assume les conséquences de nos actions. This is the thing that people, when you talk about climate change, people say, oh, it's out there somewhere, we're not concerned. But you have to bring it home every day, that this is how it's going to impact our lives. And again, using blockchain, it may be using a lot of energy, but at the same time, if this energy is coming from a renewable source, that's already, I think, it gives our conscience, it gives a good boost to our conscience. But at the same time, if we use, for example, this blockchain technology in addressing sustainable development like the forest resources or the marine ocean resources, so already we would be contributing something. So it's a question of getting the right balance, I think. Thank you.
Yes, Alexandre Derman. I'm an alumni of the school, and I've been involved with many not-for-profit associations, social impact, since I've been a student. My question is related to students. You mentioned that the awareness of the youth, in fact, and this environmental issue is going to impact also many things like migrations of human beings throughout the planet. And so do you think that this youth, the students' awareness, and we have many associations in the school acting for this, could be mentored and used in one step further in this call for action that you're saying for climate change, to go one step beyond this awareness, but just, you know, to really be part and involved. And many of our students are ready to do this, to be more involved, really down to earth. I mean, to bridge this knowing-doing gap, which we're all. Do you really think we can go one step further in this way?
Yeah, again, I'll speak as a scientist. We are very good at talking. We are very good at making all these promises, but we need actions on the ground. And this is, I think, through the young people that we will be able to channel this energy and this wish to actually make things happen on the ground. Now, by making things happen on the ground, I've talked about, for example, sustainability issues. You know, kind of mainstreaming that into our daily practices. That's one thing. For example, cutting trees down, for example. This is something that we have to educate our kids, that they have rights too. And fortunately, again, I come back to the power of institutions. We have, for example, a country like France, where you have a very powerful institution, which can rein in on the destructive thinking of some organization or some institutions or some other group or whatever. So we need to have both. But at the same time, we need actions on the ground. Now, planting trees, for example, making Paris greener. I mean, all these are positive actions which the youth can drive in order to reduce the impact. And I think many presidents, I think including President Macron, has taken on board that we need to keep on planting many more trees. But having said this, planting trees is very good, but not destroying the existing biospheres where the diversity of the world, which remain the world's lungs, that's an action that we also need to envisage very strongly. Because the diversity of 1 square kilometer in a tropical forest will be perhaps, if I may, unless of course don't take it personally, could be more diverse than the entire Europe put together. But are they aware of the diversity? Are they aware that killing the insects, these are our silent warriors? And we don't know how the bees are helping us. These are, the insects are the prime agriculturalists. They are the first agriculturalists. But how do you get the message out to the kids? Unless we engage them in our actions, in our classes, practical issues that they need to be made aware of.
Thank you. Let's continue on bridging this gap between knowledge and doing, because now you have a question of our students from the International Sustainability Management Master at ESCP. So we have students moving from Berlin to Paris, then going back to Berlin, coming from all over the world. Please.
Hi, thank you very much for your intervention. It was very interesting. And I'm very concerned on the complexity of communicating and building a bridge between science and, well, softer disciplines at a time when cross-discipline competencies are high on the agenda. You're the proof, however, that this is possible, that a bridge between hard science-based and softer dimension is possible. So how would you translate maybe beyond communication? How can education might be put at the service of science and the practice of science, perhaps? How can we become the actor of such a change while combining the both dimensions?
Education will remain the bedrock of sustainable development. Without a sound education system, without the proper grasp of technology, and we may even have to rethink our education, the way we have been giving education to our young children. We have to make it more hands-on. And some countries, I know in Southeast Asia, they're already embracing changes in the way, in the education system, so that the kids are much more aware of what is going on. So education will need to be rethought, And we need to unskill, reskill, upskill, educate, uneducate, and re-educate. So this has to be a constant for young children, so that because the speed of the warp speed at which the technology is moving, we need our kids to be fully attuned with what's going on. So you're right, we need to relook our education system, but ensure that it becomes impactful, but more importantly, it remains relevant to the changes that the world is facing.
Hi, I'm also in the same master program. And no, I was thinking a bit about the whole movement of the yellow vests in France, which was a very clear example of political willingness to try to, well, decarbonize the economy, but imposed additional taxes on the poorer parts of society. And just, is there a potential trade-off in reaching this decarbonization of the economy and actually potentially making some people worse off?
I did mention that rising inequality in the world, not mentioning yellow vests, but rising economy across the world, rising inequality across the world is a problem, right? And whatever manifestation you see on the road or on the street or whatever it is a symptom of these inequalities. And again, this is something that we increasingly have to ensure that there is a proper distribution, because the World Economic Forum has already identified this as being one of the challenges in the world. So again, rising inequality will impact precisely sustainable development, because there will not be enough resources to fund our institutions, which precisely are mandated to address health issues, which are mandated to address, all the institutions, all the service providers that our societies need. So we need to see to it that in whatever action we are doing, we need to ensure that inequality does not become the new normal. And here I repeat that inequality should not become the new normal, because it is fast becoming so. And it's all in our hands. Like JFK has said, all the problems are man-made, so there should be man-made solutions. But it needs a political will, which again, very often we tend to be quite blasé. We need to have a political will. But how do you distill that political will? This is something that we have to think about. It's not easy.
Thanks a lot. Clara, can you give the microphone there on the right side?
Good morning. My name is Ameenah Gurib-Fakim. I'm a program coordinator here at the ESCP. So my question was, today in some areas in Africa, people are struggling for food and even for water. So today, if we go there and talk about standing up for a sustainable world, they won't be all responsive. So how do you think we can engage them and change their habits?
As I've said at the beginning, Africa and small island states are the countries or the region, the nation that have contributed least to greenhouse gas emission, but they will be impacted more. Having said this, let's take, for example, the African continent. The African continent has 60% of the world's arable land. The African continent has the resources that we talk about, mineral and otherwise. The African continent also has enough water supply to satisfy the entire, and to be able to export. If you look at the Sahara, solar energy from the Sahara can power the entire European Union, the countries there. But what is lacking? What is lacking in our continent 50 years plus of independence? Where are we in terms of developing our institutions? Where are we in terms of empowering our young people? Now here, I'm talking about 2035, where Africa will be the largest supplier of human capital, young people. The median age in Africa is 16 to 18, whereas we are talking about aging populations in other regions. So what are our own governments doing to empower these people with the appropriate technologies, with the appropriate education, right? And this can only be done when we put our hands in our own pockets. And this is a narrative which still hasn't trickled down to policymakers and to politicians, that until and unless we start putting our hands in our own pocket to train our own people, we'll be forever talking about the brain drain, we'll be forever talking about migration. Why do people migrate? Why do people take their lives in their hands and cross the Mediterranean to go somewhere else? They'll be very happy to stay at home. But we as governments, we as politicians, we as policymakers have to create the appropriate ecosystems so that these young people stay there. And to be able to do this, we must be able to invest in our institutions, we must invest in our own people. Now, again, Africa, 15% of humanity, 25% of the world's disease burden, 1% generation of knowledge, 0.5% of patents produced in 2017. This is WIPO figures. South Korea, 1 country. China, 1 country. China has produced over 30% of the world's patents for 2017. Korea invests between 6 to 7% GDP in technology, in new development, in new technologies. We see the potential that these countries have had in terms of educating their own people. So, do we talk about a resource curse for Africa? I don't think we should. I think this, again, the proper spreading of these resources to our own people should be able to make a decision, be able to make a difference, but it will come only when we have enlightened politicians and policymakers and institutions, strong institutions in our countries to make it happen.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you very much for the empowering talk once again. We all agree that solutions are in attacking inequality, implementing content in the countries, in education, that can make people more conscious about this problem that we're facing. But what I've been wondering is, what can we do when some of the most powerful countries, their policymakers, not to mention the name, of course, are claiming that climate change is not existing, that all of this is an invention. So we all agree that it's the responsibility of the most developed economies to tackle this. But what to do when these powerful men are claiming that it does not exist and are withdrawing themselves sometimes from these treaties that they are part of? What can we do against that?
Let us look at this country that I didn't mention, but I will mention now. Let us look at the United States, right? Look at the GDP of the United States, and just look at one state, that if you remove that state from that confederation of other states, you'll find that the GDP will become very different. We're talking about California, we're talking about the rest of the United States. Now, California has been very pro-green policies, right? So even in one country where the messaging is, I don't believe in climate change, changes are happening already on the ground. Changes are happening through institutions, through people who are driving this process. So again, I put emphasis on each individual citizen. We have a responsibility as well to ensure that this happens. So I think even in the United States, at a federal level, we still find that within these things can happen. So we need to be able to address this at individual level, at institutional level. But I think the movement of the young people is already, I think, changing the minds that, there's something happening there, and we need to be more serious about it. So federal system in the United States is a good example that even, as I said, the messaging is out there, we don't believe this and that, but things are happening on the ground. And this is the kind of narrative that we need to be able to adopt. So my messaging to you is, become disruptors. Don't break the law, just break the rules.
Thanks a lot. I propose that we take this last question here and maybe another one here, right? And then I think we can continue with the ceremony. You.
So thank you very much for your speech. Women and children are the very first victim of the climate change, and as you're an inspiring and strong woman, how do you think women can be the change?
You know, I keep saying this and it has become a bit cliche, and I will say it again, unfortunately. We cannot win a football match by leaving 52% of the team on the bench. A bird needs 2 wings to fly, right? So we increasingly, and this is true not just for Europe, but everywhere, we need to empower our girls. If you take, for example, one sector in Africa, let's take agriculture. Agriculture by 2030 is estimated to be a $1 trillion industry. And on the continent of Africa, it's women who feed the continent. So why should we have this image of this woman with a baby on her back, digging the ground, which is in the hot, dry sun with a hoe, as being the cliche representation for agriculture in Africa? It's not true. We can make them become agro and technopreneurs. How do we do that? We need to educate the girls. Unfortunately, the figures are not there. The indicators are very poor for girls' education. So educate our girls. Make them become change makers. Make them become the vehicle through which change can happen, and it can happen.
Good morning. Hello. I'm a student from the Masters in Energy Management here at ESCP Europe.
Yes, sorry.
Hello. Sorry. Thank you very much for the talk. Very interesting, and it makes us think a little bit more about the importance of climate change. I think there's not enough people that care about it, and we should keep spreading the word. My question is, because you talked about energy sector, and we're working on that on the Masters, you talked about the responsibility of developed countries, because they were the ones that polluted the world until now, so they should take the responsibility in changing policies and actions towards mitigating climate change. Agreements like Paris in 2015 are a good step for that. But how would you think it's the best mechanism to enforce those agreements, those targets that each country settled in these treaties? Because as you know, for example, in the Kyoto Protocol, the targets have not been met. So how do you think would be the best mechanism to really enforce the countries responsible for climate change to meet their targets?
Let's not apportion blame. Huh? Let's not say that the rich countries have polluted. I think what, as I said in my speech, they have a responsibility to lead. They have a responsibility to lead because they have the means, they have the institution, they have the human resources to be able to lead. Now, the success for me at the Paris Agreement was precisely because all countries took the commitment to deliver on the NDCs, right? And eventually the INDCs, which become the intention, and eventually at the Paris Agreement, then of course it got translated into the NDCs. So each country, they have had they have owned up to the fact that each country has to bring their own contribution to the table. Now, at the end of the day, just like most, like the SDGs, the MDGs, countries will be taken to task at the end of the period, by 2030, for example, to say, what have you done? So it will be down to the governments to see to it that they have delivered on the goals, because they have made a promise in 2015 in Paris to actually deliver, to be, for example, in my country, we took the commitment to reduce, or to increase rather, sustainable energy by 25%. So if we don't meet the target, we have to explain why we didn't do it. So we'll have to account for this, and this is something that has been really rightly niched in the MDGs and in the SDGs, so that countries become accountable for whatever commitment they took. So this will be the driving force, I think, for putting more resources, and also not just resources, but also sharing good practices, because a lot of things are happening in the world, but they need to have the kind of absorptive capacity in these countries to be able to actually implement all these good practices which are happening elsewhere.
I don't want to add a gloomy layer, but we should also be aware that nowadays, today, only 16 of those countries that committed in the COP21 are on the road to achieve their targets. So that's why the question of how can we be sure that oral commitment translates into action and into real impact is still a question that is, and none of the European countries are part of the 16 countries that are on the road to achieve good results. So I don't want to end on this negative loop, so that's why I promise you the final question. I hope it will be.
Thanks so much. I'm the president of ESCP Foundation, and I'm also an alumni of the school. We are in a business school, and I do believe that one element which is missing in many speech and discussion right now, it's about the role of finance, capital allocation. And I do believe that one of the reasons for which the action is not at the level which is expected, it's because corporation, private sector are not sanctioned on their valuation, and the fact that maybe in the future their assets will not be used anymore and the value is not the values that they're really sure right now. So I do believe that the finance sector and the standard setter should look at this to drive the action and force capital allocation to go to this new economy. And I would like to hear from you your thought about it and what should be done to really accelerate on this, because as usual, money is what is driving the people to do things. At the same time, I'm also appalled of the fact that not knowing this valuation, it does not enable the government and the policymaker to make the choice of taxing the one who destroy and at the same time awarding the one who create value. And that would be a way of also driving action. And I'm also appalled that in this country, where we have just given up on the carbon tax, it's not creating the right momentum and it's confusing people. So I would be glad to hear about what are your thoughts as a policymaker and a politician.
Yes. Well, I think, as I said, the reason why Paris has been successful is precisely because pledges have been made. Now, when pledges have been made, well, already by 2020, we will see whether the 200 billion which have been pledged have been achieved, have been reached. That's one thing. Second thing is that, yes, we need to have the appropriate funds. And again, here, I also stress, again, I will stress on the fact that we are in a country like France, which has the potential of being a leader on the climate. So we need to lead. And by leading, we need to recognize those who are doing well. So we need to be able to compensate and recognize that. And those who are not doing well, they also need to be taken to task as to why they're not doing well. Having said this, we will be able to move fastest, for example, in energy. But what people, again, don't seem to see is that the technologies which are there to address these challenges, these technologies are getting cheaper and cheaper and have to be mainstream in countries. So again, communication there, because people still tend to think that oil and gas and coal still remain the solution. They still don't see that the renewables are there. So in terms of the incentives for people to adopt these new technologies, again, has to be addressed by these leaders which are here. And the other thing I will say, now the challenges also, they are mostly in the poorer countries, in the developing countries, because if you want to suppress, if you want to reduce, for example, one main contentious issue of migration is to empower these countries with the appropriate tools, with the appropriate technologies for these people to stay in where they are, and this becomes a lesser aggravating issue. But these countries, precisely, that have these challenges, these are precisely the countries that don't have the institutions to be able to adopt the technologies, to be able to adopt and, of course, use the finances. They don't have the absorptive capacity to absorb the finances. So how do you create this balance between these countries? Again, this is something that we need to think about. The good practices, the cheap technologies which can be used to make a difference, but the bottom baseline will remain funds, which have to be. Now, if you look at our world economy, France is a country which is trillions of US dollars. If you look at the United States, trillion of US dollars. If you look at China, trillions of US dollars in terms of the economy. Do you feel that 200 billion is a lot of money to address our existential problem? I don't think so. Yet we tend to think that 200 billion is a lot of money. This is not a lot of money. It is not. So we need to be able to, again, put our hands in our pocket if we want to see a difference on the ground. It comes back to what I said before with Africa. It comes back again to Europe. It comes back to the United States. Let us mean business by walking the talk. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Oui, oui. I think I'm also going to ask my good colleagues from the school, Bertrand, Léon, Valérie, our two good sustainable development promoters, Aurélien and Valentina, to come forward, as well as the chairman of our ESCP Foundation, Christian Bouillon. Your Excellency, dear Ameenah, dear guests, dear colleagues from the Paris Île-de-France Chamber of Commerce, our mother institution, dear colleagues, dear alumni, it is a great moment. Come forward. I'll put myself here. As Executive President and Dean of the school, it is my great pleasure to renew my welcome into the ESCP community. These are not just words. It's coming from the heart of the institution, and it's been a long process. You have said a lot about the importance of the younger generations. And this is our job here in a higher education institution to promote and prepare the leaders, the policymakers of tomorrow. Not just in that very narrow segment of business, but also, very much so, looking at things as you do with a systems approach. And that is not so common. We all heard your speech, breathtaking, stimulating, fascinating also, with the precision of figures in the light of the challenges and the threats that you put forward. It is a special year for us, 2019, at ESCP Europe, because it's the bicentenary, the oldest business school in this world, where the concept of entrepreneurship was coined. And you have that so much in you. Also to say that we are here and we heard you today, on that special day, the 29th of May. Lots of things happened in this world on the 29th of May, but certainly maybe one thing that we will remember is the big achievement over nature of man. In other words, it's when Hillary and Norgay did reach the summit of the Everest in the Himalaya chain. And we have an important other moment today, which is that of the awarding of Doctorate, Honoris Causa. And I think that having heard you all, and including the excitement with the questions that came, clearly Honoris Causa means something today for the sake of honorable achievements. It is not very common that at ESCP Europe we do award and bestow upon people those doctorates. It happens very much only with very distinguished individuals. Very few, in fact, we have had. We've had great people like Nicole Fontaine, whom you knew, as the President of the European Parliament. Also Hans-Gert Pöttering, his German equivalent. Today, there is something that we want really to put together with that degree it's not just recognizing your path as a dean, vice chancellor of a university and specialist of organic chemistry. But we want to recognize the social chemistry and the societal chemistry that you manage to aggregate and produce. The choice of the school was an incredible process through which the top management bodies, like the Senate and the academic colleagues here, we are recognizing in you, of course, the academic achievements and the L'Oréal UNESCO award is very meaningful. But also there is more. And we know that you fight, as you showed, a lot for education as the lever for transformation of tomorrow. And I know also that you will be doing speeches in Cambridge and Oxford, in other institutions, with so strong messages. Also impressed, of course, because of your being a political figure. And of course, you're promoting a very meaningful, modern society. Also, what we like very much and that we cherish so much at ESCP Europe is that fighting, combating, entrepreneurial spirit. And Bertrand, when he made the introduction, spoke about all of your roles, but also what you did in the United Nations circle with the Sustainable Development Goals that you presided over, I think on water in particular. And I let alone other things that you do so well and so regularly. Warning us on challenges for business leaders is very, very key. And I think that there is something I was, when I was listening, had something crossing my mind, which is the Pasteur, another great scientist in this country, who said that chance only favors the prepared mind. You know that expression. It was not pronounced in anything like Paris. It was pronounced in deep rural France, in Douai, in the north of France. So it shows that scientists were traveling more than you think to spread the word in those days. And this is what you've done also, I feel, this morning, in helping higher education transform into the shaping of tomorrow's world. And I like very much what Valentina and Aurelia are doing, pushing, of course, not only the content of programs, but also pushing us as colleagues to transform the way we see the world. So, at this point in time, Your Excellency, dear Ameenah, as a sign of appreciation and recognition of this incredible talent, because you are a personality, but you also have a personality that everybody this morning has realized you have. I know, and you said it, I heard, you hate the notion of increase in degrees of the climate. But this morning I have to increase the number of your degrees of a different nature, and academic degrees, that is. And this is why, with this red color, being dressed in the same attire as the Supreme Courts in this country, I am very happy to bestow upon you and award the title, the degree, and the insignia of a Doctor Honoris Causa of ESCP. Thank you. congratulations on behalf of all of the school, and I'm sure in the name of all the members present. This is a great honor and a big source of pride for us all.
Thank you. Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. C'est avec un très grand honneur, très grande humilité que j'accepte cette très grande distinction de cette institution remarquable qu'est ESCP. So, thank you so much. I'm humbled and I'm grateful. Thank you.
There will be a little moment for sharing and exchanging around not only the content, but also sharing, as I said, with a great personality. Thank you so much. There is a little cocktail outside, so that if you have a little bit of time with us, you can stay on. And it will be for something like 20 minutes just outside here.